Hello everyone, and welcome back to Veiled Terrors. Today I am back with 9 absolutely terrifying swamp horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the murky waters of our nation's wetlands. In this episode, we will venture deep into the most forsaken marshlands and bayous, where the boundaries between our world and something far more sinister become dangerously thin. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters documented by individuals who found themselves face-to-face with forces that defy all logical explanation. Each account has been meticulously verified through witness testimonies, local records, and first-hand documentation from those brave enough to share their harrowing experiences. From phantom vessels gliding silently through midnight waters to ancient burial grounds that refuse to stay buried, these stories will take you to places where the living dare not tread and the dead refuse to rest. The witnesses have entrusted us with their most terrifying moments. And while some names and specific locations have been changed to protect their privacy, the core truth of each encounter remains untouched. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Veiled Terrors for daily true horror content that will keep you awake long after the lights go out. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when darkness calls, because tonight we are diving deeper into the swamp than anyone should ever dare to go. Kaysen had always found peace on the water. At 22, the college student from Baton Rouge had spent countless weekends exploring the intricate network of bayou that snaked through southern Louisiana like ancient arteries, carrying secrets from a forgotten past. Spring break of his junior year at LSU was no different. He and 3 friends had planned a night fishing expedition to Bayou, a place where Spanish moss draped the cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and the water moved with the slow, deliberate pulse of something alive and breathing. The evening air was thick with humidity as they loaded their aluminum boat with coolers, tackle boxes, and enough supplies for an all-night adventure. Marcus, his roommate since freshman year, had brought his grandfather's vintage Coleman lantern that cast dancing shadows across their eager faces. Sarah, a preemed student with an adventurous streak, packed her camera, hoping to capture the ethereal beauty of the swamp at night. And then there was Jake, the skeptic of the group, who never missed an opportunity to debunk what he called the ridiculous superstitions of the old-timers who lived along these waterways. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, they pushed off from the weathered dock at Bro Bridge. The familiar hum of the outboard motor cut through the symphony of frogs and cicadas that had begun their nightly chorus. Kaysen navigated the narrow channels with the confidence of someone who had memorized every fallen log and hidden sandbar. The beam of their spotlight swept across the water ahead, illuminating eyes that glowed like amber jewels before disappearing beneath the surface with barely a ripple. 2 hours into their journey, they reached their favorite fishing spot where the bayou widened into a natural basin surrounded by towering bald cypress trees. Their trunks, swollen at the base like the legs of sleeping giants, disappeared into the black water that reflected the stars like scattered diamonds. The silence here was different from anywhere else Cassine had ever experienced. It was not merely the absence of sound, but something deeper, as if the very air held its breath in reverence for whatever ancient spirits dwelt in these waters. They anchored near a cluster of cypress knees that jutted from the water like the gnarled fingers of buried hands. The Coleman lantern cast a warm circle of light around their boat, creating an island of safety in the vast darkness that pressed against them from all directions. Sarah unpacked her camera and began taking long exposure shots of the moonlight filtering through the Spanish moss, while Marcus and Jake prepared their fishing lines with the practice efficiency of weekend warriors. It was just past midnight when Casson first noticed the mist. It began as wisps of vapor rising from the water like the breath of sleeping ghosts. But within minutes, it had thickened into a wall of fog that seemed to move with purpose rather than drift with the barely perceptible breeze. The temperature dropped noticeably, and their breath became visible in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the humid air. The fog brought with it a silence, so complete that even the ever-present chorus of night sounds fell away until the only noise was the gentle lapping of water against their aluminum hull. Sarah stopped taking pictures and stared into the mist with wide eyes. Marcus reeled in his line and moved closer to the center of the boat. Even Jake, usually quick with a rational explanation for any unusual phenomenon, sat in uncharacteristic quiet, his fishing rod forgotten in his hands. That was when they heard the paddle. The sound came from somewhere in the fog, rhythmic and deliberate, like the measured strokes of someone who'd been navigating these waters for decades. Splash, drip, splash, drip. Each stroke was accompanied by the soft sound of water droplets falling back to the surface. But there was something wrong with the rhythm. Something that made the hair on the back of Cassian's neck stand at attention. The strokes were too precise, too mechanical, as if whatever was propelling the unseen vessel had no need for the natural variations in timing that came with human fatigue, or the subtle corrections required to maintain direction in moving water. Cason called out into the fog, his voice sounding strangely muffled and flat in the thick air. "Hello out there, everything all right?" The paddling stopped immediately, so abruptly that it seemed as if his words had physically severed whatever force was driving the invisible craft. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension, like the moment before lightning strikes, when every living thing instinctively seeks shelter. Then, emerging from the wall of mist, like something materialized from the collective nightmares of everyone who had ever feared the dark, came a canoe. It was not a modern vessel of fiberglass or aluminum, but something that belonged to another era entirely. The wood was dark with age and water damage, its surface scarred with deep gouges that could have been made by anything from submerged branches to the claws of creatures best left unidentified. Intricate carvings decorated the bow, symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light of their lantern, never quite allowing the eye to focus on their true meaning. But it was the absence of any visible occupant that transformed curiosity into terror. The canoe moved with steady purpose, gliding across the water with impossible silence. No paddle broke the surface. No figure could be seen within the vessel. Yet it approached their position with the confidence of something that knew exactly where it was going and why. The water around it seemed darker somehow, as if the canoe existed in its own pocket of deeper night. Sarah raised her camera instinctively, but when she pressed the shutter, nothing happened. The LCD screen flickered and died, leaving them with only the wavering light of the Coleman lantern to illuminate the impossible scene. Unfolding before them, Marcus grabbed the spotlight and aimed it directly at the approaching canoe, but the beam seemed to bend around the vessel, creating a void of shadow that their light could not penetrate. Jake, his usual skepticism replaced by primal fear, fumbled for the starter rope of their outboard motor. His hands shook as he pulled again and again, but the engine that had run perfectly all evening now refused to turn over. The familiar click of the electric start button produced nothing but silence, as if the fog had somehow severed their connection to the mechanical world they understood and trusted. The phantom canoe came to rest approximately 10 feet from their boat, close enough that they could see the intricate details of its construction, but still shrouded in that unnatural darkness that seemed to cling to it like a second skin. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rapid breathing of 4 college students who suddenly found themselves confronting something that challenged every rational explanation they had ever accepted about the world and their place in it. Then they heard the laughter. It began as a soft giggle, the sound a child might make while playing hide and seek in the fading light of evening. But there was something hollow about it. something that spoke of joy corrupted by decades of separation from anything resembling life or warmth. The laughter multiplied as if several children had joined in the game, their voices echoing from within the empty canoe with an acoustic impossibility that made Cassian's skin crawl with terror. The voices were young, innocent in their tone, but terrible in their context. They spoke in French, the old Acadian dialect that Cassian's grandmother had used when she told stories of the early settlers who had carved homes from this wilderness with nothing but determination and faith. But these voices carried neither warmth nor comfort. Instead, they whispered of water closing over small heads, of desperate struggles against currents too strong for young arms, of final breaths taken beneath the surface that reflected the last light they would ever see. Sarah began to cry, quiet sobs that she tried to muffle with her hands, as the reality of their situation settled over them like a burial shroud. Marcus reached out and grabbed Cassian's arm, his fingers digging into flesh with desperate strength, as if physical contact with another living person could somehow anchor him to the world of the rational and explainable. Jake had gone completely silent, his face pale in the lantern light as he stared at the phantom vessel with the fixed attention of someone whose mind was struggling to process information that simply did not fit within any framework he had ever constructed for understanding reality. The children's voices grew more insistent, their laughter taking on an edge of sadness that spoke of profound loneliness and an eternity spent searching for something that could never be found. They began to call out names, French names that belonged to another century, voices rising from the empty canoe in a chorus of the lost and forgotten. Marie, they called, Pierre Baptiste, come play with us. Come into the water where it is cool and dark and peaceful. Come where the current will carry you to places where time has no meaning and the pain of the living world cannot follow. The fog began to thicken around their boat, pressing in from all sides until visibility dropped to mere inches beyond the weak circle of lantern light. The phantom canoe started to move again, but this time it began to circle them with slow, deliberate movements that created no wake, no disturbance in the water whatsoever. Each revolution brought it slightly closer, the gap between the vessels narrowing with each pass like a noose tightening around the neck of a condemned prisoner. Kyson tried the radio, but static was the only response to his desperate calls for help. Their cell phones showed no signal. Not unexpected in this remote location, but somehow more ominous given their current circumstances. They were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a pocket of reality, where the normal rules seemed to have been suspended in favor of something far older and infinitely more dangerous. The circling continued for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes. Time itself seeming to lose coherence in the presence of whatever force animated the phantom vessel. The children's voices never stopped, rising and falling in a symphony of innocent menace that spoke of games that had no winners, and playmates who never grew older or wiser, or more careful about the dangers that lurked beneath the deceptively calm surface of bayou waters. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the phantom canoe stopped its circling and began to retreat into the fog. The children's laughter faded gradually, not dying away naturally, but simply becoming fainter as distance grew between them and whatever realm these lost souls inhabited. The mist began to lift, revealing stars that had been watching silently from above throughout their entire ordeal. Their outboard motor started on the first pull, roaring to life with a sound so normal and mechanical that it brought tears of relief to Sarah's eyes. The radio crackled back to life with the late-night chatter of commercial fishermen working the deeper waters of the Atchafalaya Basin. Their cell phones showed full signal strength, as if they had never lost contact with the network of towers that connected them to the waking world. But as they raced back toward the safety of the dock at Bro Bridge, none of them spoke about what they had witnessed, The phantom canoe had disappeared as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only the memory of children's laughter echoing across dark water and the terrible knowledge that some games once begun never truly end. They had encountered something that existed in the spaces between heartbeats. In the pause between one breath and the next, in the moment when sleep finally claims consciousness and the barriers between worlds grow thin enough for the desperate and the lost to cross. Case never returned to a section of Bayou, though he continued to fish other waters throughout his remaining years at LSU. Sometimes on particularly foggy nights when the air hung heavy with moisture and memory, he would hear children's laughter carried on the wind and know that somewhere in the darkness, a phantom canoe still glided silently through waters that held secrets too dangerous for the living to fully comprehend. Malia had always been drawn to the forgotten corners of the natural world, those places where wildlife photographers rarely ventured and park rangers seldom patrolled. As a freelance photographer specializing in endangered bird species, she had spent 3 years documenting the slow disappearance of Florida's most vulnerable avian populations. The Florida Everglades, with its vast network of waterways and hammocks, offered both sanctuary and mystery to creatures that existed on the razor's edge between survival and extinction. This particular assignment had brought her deeper into the river of grass than she had ever traveled before. The Audubon Society had commissioned her to photograph the last known nesting site of the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, a small gray bird that existed nowhere else on Earth, except for a few scattered locations within Everglades National Park. The nesting area was located on an isolated hammock that required a 2-day journey by airboat and foot to reach, far from the established tourist trails, where most wildlife photographers were content to capture their sanitized images of Florida's wilderness. Her guide, a weathered senile man named Robert, who had grown up in these waters, had warned her about the deeper regions of the Everglades where they were heading. He spoke of places where the water turned black with tannins from ancient cypress trees, where the usual sounds of birds and insects fell silent, and where even the most experienced outdoorsmen sometimes lost their way despite decades of navigating these waterways. But Malaya had dismissed his warnings as the typical folklore that surrounded any wilderness area. Colorful stories meant to add mystique to what was in her scientific mind simply a complex ecosystem that operated according to natural laws. The first day of their journey proceeded without incident. They traveled through the familiar tourist zones where great blue herons stood motionless in shallow water, and anhinga spread their wings to dry in the afternoon sun. Malia captured dozens of reference shots, establishing the normal baseline of Everglades wildlife that would provide context for her more specialized work. They made camp on a small island of higher ground where Robert built a fire and prepared fresh fish he had caught during their afternoon travel. The conversation was easy, filled with his stories of growing up in harmony with this ancient landscape, and her enthusiasm for conservation efforts that might save species from the relentless encroachment of development. The second day took them into waters that few outsiders ever saw. The channels narrowed significantly, forcing Robert to navigate between cypress knees and sorass clusters with the practiced precision of someone whose ancestors had traveled these same routes for centuries. The water here was darker, stained the color of strong tea by the organic compounds leached from decomposing vegetation. Malaya noticed that her camera's light meter readings became increasingly erratic as they ventured deeper, requiring constant manual adjustments to maintain proper exposure settings. It was mid-afternoon when they reached the coordinates provided by the research team. But the hammock where the sparrow colony was supposed to nest was nowhere to be found. Robert circled the area several times, consulting his GPS unit and comparing the readings with landmarks that should have been clearly visible. The confusion on his weathered face was evident as he shut off the airboat's engine and allowed them to drift in the strange silence that seemed to characterize this section of the Everglades. That was when Malia first noticed the island that did not appear on any of their maps. It's at perhaps 200 YD to the east. A low mound of earth barely rising above the waterline, covered with what appeared to be patches of white sand or shell fragments that caught the afternoon sunlight like scattered mirrors. Through her telephoto lens, the island looked unremarkable, just another of the countless small formations that dotted the Everglades landscape. But something about it drew her attention with an intensity she could not rationally explain. Robert reluctantly agreed to investigate, though she noticed his usual easy confidence had been replaced by a weariness that seemed disproportionate to their simple change of plans. As they approached the mysterious island, Malaya began to understand his reluctance. What she had mistaken for white sand or shells through her telephoto lens revealed itself to be something far more disturbing as they drew closer. The island was covered entirely with bones. Not the scattered remains one might expect to find in any wilderness area where predators and scavengers had done their work, but an intricate arrangement of skeletal remains that had been deliberately organized into patterns that spoke of intelligence and purpose. Rib cages formed perfect circles around central arrangements of skulls. Long bones had been sorted by size and arranged in radiating lines like the spokes of enormous wheels. Vertebrae created spiraling pathways that led the eye inexorably toward the center of the island, where something waited that her mind refused to process. Her camera equipment began to malfunction the moment they set foot on the bone-covered ground. The battery indicator, which had shown 3/4 charge when they left that morning, now flashed red warnings of imminent power failure. Her backup batteries, tested and verified before departure, registered as completely dead when inserted into the camera body. Even her mechanical film camera, which required no electrical power whatsoever, seemed to jam repeatedly, the film advance lever refusing to operate smoothly. Robert had gone completely silent. His usual stream of commentary about wildlife and local history replaced by a tension so palpable that Malia could feel it like pressure against her skin. He moved carefully among the bone arrangements, never stepping directly on any of the skeletal remains, following invisible pathways between the macabre displays with the careful attention of someone navigating a minefield. The bones themselves defied easy categorization. While most appeared to be from typical Everglades wildlife, alligators, birds, various mammals, there were others that seemed wrong somehow, proportioned in ways that did not match any species in her extensive knowledge of Florida fauna. Skulls with too many teeth, rib cages that curved in impossible directions, femurs that were either far too long or strangely short for the creatures they had supposedly supported in life. The arrangement suggested not random death, but deliberate collection, as if something had been gathering specimens according to criteria that remained hidden from outside observation. At the center of the island, surrounded by concentric circles of increasingly exotic skeletal remains, stood a single structure that challenged every scientific principle Malaya had ever accepted. It was a tower of bones perhaps 8 feet in height, constructed with engineering precision that would have impressed master architects. Vertebrae formed the central support column, while ribs created intricate flying buttresses that provided structural stability. The entire construction was crowned with a ring of skulls, their empty eye sockets facing outward in all directions like the heads of ancient sentinels, keeping eternal watch over the surrounding swamp land. As she circled the bone tower, trying desperately to document what she was seeing, despite her camera's continued malfunctions, Malaya began to hear something that made her blood run cold. It started as a barely perceptible vibration, a frequency so low that she felt it in her bones rather than hearing it with her ears. Gradually, the vibration resolved itself into what could only be described as chanting, though the language was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The words, if they were words, seemed to emanate from the bone arrangements themselves, as if the skeletal remains had retained some echo of the voices that had once given them life. Robert grabbed her arm with sudden urgency, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. He spoke rapidly in Kasuki, his native language, though she caught enough English words mixed into his urgent speech to understand that they needed to leave immediately. But when they turned toward their airboat, Malaya discovered that the island had somehow grown larger during their exploration. What had been a small mound barely 50 feet across now stretched in all directions far beyond, where she remembered the water's edge being located. Her GPS unit showed their location as constantly shifting, the coordinates changing even as they stood motionless among the bone arrangements. The compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north in an environment where the normal rules of navigation seemed to have been suspended. Robert tried to start the airboat, but the engine that had run perfectly all day now refused to turn over, producing only clicking sounds that seemed to echo and multiply among the bone structures until the entire island rang with mechanical percussion. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and Malier realized that the empty eye sockets of the skulls were no longer empty. Points of light, pale and cold as winter stars, had appeared in the depths of each socket, and these lights were all focused directly on her and Robert. The bone arrangements began to shift and rearrange themselves, the careful patterns dissolving and reforming in new configurations that hurt to look at directly. Geometries that violated fundamental principles of three-dimensional space. Time became fluid and unreliable. What felt like hours of desperate attempts to escape might have been minutes, or it might have been days. The sun seemed frozen in place above them, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources and created patches of darkness where no darkness should have been able to exist. Malia's watch had stopped at 3:17 p.m., though whether that was afternoon or morning, she could no longer determine. It was only when the bone lights began to dim with the approach of what might have been dusk that the spell holding them seemed to weaken. The airboat engine coughed to life on Robert's next attempt. And suddenly, they found themselves at the edge of a small, unremarkable island that was perhaps 30 feet across and covered with nothing more unusual than sawgrass and a few scattered palm fronds. Their GPS unit showed their correct location. Their compass pointed steadily north, and Malaya's camera equipment functioned perfectly when she tested it. But the memory card in her digital camera contained dozens of photographs she did not remember taking. Images of bone arrangements photographed from impossible angles and perspectives that suggested she had been floating high above the island during their visit. The film in her backup camera, when developed weeks later, showed only blank frames except for a single shot that captured the bone tower in perfect detail, surrounded by lights that formed patterns she recognized from no earthly source. Robert never spoke of what they had experienced, deflecting her questions with gentle changes of subject whenever she tried to discuss the events of that day. The Cape Sable seaside sparrow colony they had originally set out to document was found the following week by another research team, located exactly where it was supposed to be, according to their original coordinates. But Malaya never returned to that section of the Everglades, haunted by the knowledge that somewhere in the vast wilderness, an island of bones continued its ancient work of collection and arrangement, waiting patiently for the next visitors who might venture too far from the established paths, where human understanding still held sway over older, more dangerous forms of knowledge. Dr. Jason Reeves had dedicated her career to understanding the mysteries of bioluminescence in marine environments. But nothing in her 15 years of research had prepared her for what she would encounter in the coastal swamps of North Carolina during the summer of her 34th year. As a marine biologist with the University of North Carolina's Institute of Marine Sciences, she had studied countless species that produced their own light through chemical reactions, from deep-sea anglerfish to the microscopic dinoflagellates that created glowing waves along tropical shorelines. But the phenomenon she witnessed that night challenged every scientific principle she had ever accepted about the natural world. The research project that brought her to the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge was routine enough. A 3-month study of water quality changes in coastal freshwater systems and their impact on local fish populations. The refuge, with its unique blend of freshwater swamps and salt marshes, provided an ideal laboratory for studying how marine and freshwater ecosystems adapted to the increasing salination caused by rising sea levels and more frequent storm surges. Her research station was a modified mobile laboratory that she had positioned on a floating platform, anchored in a remote section of the refuge where human disturbance was minimal and wildlife observations could be conducted under natural conditions. The work required her to collect water samples and monitor fish populations during both daylight and nighttime hours. As many species displayed different behavioral patterns depending on the time of day, she'd grown comfortable working alone in the darkness, guided by waterproof flashlights and the soft glow of her scientific instruments. The swamp at night was alive with sounds that spoke of an ecosystem in perfect balance. The splash of beaver tails, the haunting calls of great horned owls, and the gentle movement of water against cypress trunks that had stood sentinel in these waters for centuries. It was during her 7th week at the research site, on a night when the moon was nothing more than a silver crescent hanging low over the horizon, that Jason first noticed the unusual disturbance in the water, approximately 50 yards from her floating laboratory. Her initial assumption was that she was observing the wake pattern of a large alligator, as the creatures were common in these waters and often active during the cooler nighttime hours. But as she focused her attention on the movement, she realized that something about the disturbance pattern was fundamentally wrong. The wake was too straight, too consistent, lacking the sinusoidal movement characteristic of swimming reptiles. More disturbing was the fact that whatever was creating the disturbance seemed to be moving against the current with no apparent effort, maintaining a perfectly steady course, despite the tidal flow that should have deflected any swimming creature from such a precise trajectory. Through her binoculars, she could discern no shape above the waterline, only the V-shaped wake that suggested something large moving just beneath the surface with purposeful determination. Then she noticed the glow. It began as a faint luminescence trailing behind the invisible swimmer, a soft green radiance that pulsed gently like a heartbeat made visible. At first, she dismissed it as bioluminescent algae being disturbed by whatever creature was moving through the water, a common enough phenomenon in coastal environments where microscopic organisms produce light when agitated. But as she watched more carefully, she realized that the light was too organized, too deliberate to be the random sparkling of disturbed microorganisms. The luminescence formed patterns along the length of whatever was moving beneath the surface. Spiraling bands of green light wrapped around an invisible form, pulsing in waves that traveled from what appeared to be the head toward the tail, in a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic in its regularity. The patterns reminded her of the bioluminescent displays she had observed in certain deep-sea creatures, but scaled up to a size that would indicate an organism far larger than any known species in these waters. Jason reached for her underwater camera equipment. But as she prepared to document this unprecedented phenomenon, the glowing form changed direction abruptly and began moving directly toward a research platform. The wake pattern shifted from a straight line to a series of graceful S-curves that brought the creature closer with each undulation. The bioluminescent patterns intensified as it approached, the green glow becoming bright enough to illuminate the dark water around it and reveal glimpses of scales that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. As the creature drew near, Jacine realized she was looking at a serpent of extraordinary size and impossible beauty. The snake was easily 20 feet in length, its body as thick as her torso, covered in scales that each contained what appeared to be individual light-producing cells. The patterns of illumination were not random, but formed intricate designs that flowed along the serpent's length like living tattoos. Its head, when it finally rose above the surface near her platform, was triangular and ancient, with eyes that glowed with the same green radiance as its scales, but held an intelligence that seemed to recognize her presence and evaluate her worthiness. The creature made no aggressive moves toward her platform. Instead, it held position in the water beside her laboratory, its massive head swaying gently from side to side as if listening to sounds beyond human perception. The bioluminescent patterns along its body continued their mesmerizing display, and Jacine found herself drawn to follow the waves of light as they pulsed from head to tail in sequences that seemed to convey meaning, as if the serpent were attempting to communicate through its living light show. After several minutes of this strange standoff, the glowing serpent began to move away from her platform, but slowly, repeatedly looking back as if expecting her to follow. The behavior was so clearly intentional, so obviously an invitation, that Jacine found herself starting the small outboard motor attached to her inflatable research boat before her rational mind could override the compulsion. Something deep within her consciousness responded to the serpent's call with an urgency that bypassed logical thought and spoke directly to instincts she had not known she possessed. Following the creature through the dark swamp channels, Jacine found herself in sections of the refuge she had never explored. Waterways so narrow that cypress branches brushed against her boat as she navigated by the light of her mysterious guide. The serpent maintained a steady pace, always staying within sight, but never allowing her to get close enough for detailed observation. Its bioluminescent patterns provided the only illumination in the dense swamp environment, creating a dreamlike procession through waters that seemed to exist outside normal time and space. The journey continued for what felt like hours, though when Jacine checked her watch, she discovered that the hands had stopped at 11:47. Frozen at the moment she had first noticed the creature's approach to her platform. Her GPS unit showed only static, unable to acquire satellite signals despite the clear night sky above. Even her compass spun aimlessly, unable to find magnetic north in an environment where the normal rules of navigation seemed to have been suspended in favor of something far more ancient and mysterious. The serpent finally came to rest in a circular pool, surrounded by towering cypress trees whose trunks formed what appeared to be a natural cathedral. Spanish moss hung like curtains from the branches above, creating an enclosed space that felt sacred and timeless. Here, the creature's bioluminescence intensified to a degree that illuminated the entire area in soft green light, revealing details that made Jacine question everything she thought she understood about the natural world. The pool was not a natural formation, but clearly artificial, its walls constructed from stones fitted together with precision that spoke of intelligence and purpose. Carved symbols covered many of the stones, designs that seemed to shift and change in the creature's fluctuating light, never quite allowing her eyes to focus on their true meaning. At the center of the pool stood what appeared to be the wreckage of an aircraft, its metal surfaces green with decades of corrosion, but still clearly identifiable as military in origin. As Jacine maneuvered her boat closer to investigate, the Serpent positioned itself directly in front of the wreckage, its luminescent patterns becoming more agitated and intense. The light show now included flashes of other colors, blue, gold, and silver, that created a complex visual symphony unlike anything in her scientific experience. Through the aircraft's broken canopy, she could see the skeletal remains of what had once been the pilot, still strapped into his seat, his flight helmet bearing markings that identified him as United States Army Air Forces. The Serpent's behavior became increasingly urgent, its massive head gesturing toward the wreckage in movements that clearly indicated she should investigate further. But as Jacine reached for her underwater flashlight to examine the aircraft more closely, she noticed movement within the cockpit that made her blood run cold. The skeletal remains of the pilot appeared to be moving, not with the random motion of bones disturbed by water current, but with the deliberate gestures of someone attempting to communicate. The pilot's skull turned toward her with mechanical precision, its empty sockets somehow conveying desperate urgency. Despite the absence of eyes or any other features capable of expression, one skeletal hand rose slowly to point at something attached to the instrument panel, while the other gestured repeatedly toward Jacine herself, as if trying to convey information of critical importance. The Serpent's bioluminescent display reached a crescendo of activity, patterns racing along its length so rapidly that they created an almost stroboscopic effect. Through the broken canopy, Jacine could see that the object the skeletal pilot was indicating was a leather pouch somehow preserved. Despite decades of submersion in the swamp water, the pilot's gestures became more insistent, his skeletal form animated by some force that defied every law of physics she had ever studied. The Serpent began to circle her boat, its luminous patterns creating a hypnotic spiral of light that seemed to draw her consciousness deeper into a realm where scientific skepticism held no power over ancient mysteries. Fighting against an overwhelming urge to enter the water and retrieve the pouch, Jacine forced herself to start her outboard motor and back away from the wreckage. The moment her boat began to move, both the Serpent and the animated skeleton became frantic in their attempts to prevent her departure. The creature's bioluminescence flared to blinding intensity, while the pilot's skeletal hands gestured with mechanical desperation, as if her leaving would condemn him to another eternity of waiting in his underwater tomb. But Jacine's scientific training ultimately overcame the supernatural compulsion that had drawn her into this impossible situation. She navigated by memory and instinct through the dark channels, no longer guided by the Serpent's light, following water flow and the direction of moss growth on tree trunks to find her way back to familiar territory. When she finally reached her research platform, her watch had resumed normal operation, showing 3:22 a.m. Though she had no memory of the intervening hours between her departure and return. Her research notes for that evening contained detailed observations of water temperature, pH levels, and fish population counts that she did not remember recording. Her underwater camera had somehow captured dozens of photographs of the glowing Serpent and the crashed aircraft. Images so clear and detailed that they provided irrefutable evidence of her extraordinary encounter. But when she attempted to report her findings to her colleagues at the university, the photographs disappeared from her camera's memory card, leaving only blank files that contained no trace of the impossible scenes they had documented. The Serpent never appeared to her again, though she completed her remaining weeks at the research site, hoping for another encounter. Local historians she consulted confirmed that a P-51 Mustang had indeed gone missing over the area in 1943. Its pilot's body never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The aircraft and its occupant remained classified as missing in action, one of thousands of wartime mysteries that would never be satisfactorily resolved. Jacine returned to her normal research activities, but she never forgot the night when bioluminescence took on intelligence and purpose. When the boundaries between the living and the dead became as fluid as the dark waters, where ancient guardians continued their eternal watch over secrets too dangerous for the rational world to comprehend. Park Ranger Sincere Washington had spent 12 years patrolling the Canoe National Wildlife Refuge. And in that time, he had learned to distinguish between the sounds that belonged to the natural nighttime symphony of the swamp and those that did not. As the senior ranger responsible for the refuge's most remote sections, he had investigated countless reports of unusual phenomena that turned out to be nothing more than tourists misinterpreting the calls of barred owls or the splash of alligators sliding from logs into dark water. But the reports that began filtering in during the late summer of his 13th year on the job were different from anything he had encountered in his career with the National Park Service. The calls started coming in around the third week of August, always from visitors who had been camping in the Bayou areas accessible only by canoe or motorboat. They described hearing singing coming from deep within the swamp. During the hours just after midnight, voices raised in hymns that echoed across the water with impossible clarity, despite the distance and atmospheric conditions that should have muffled any sound to unintelligible whispers. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A full choir of perhaps 30 or 40 voices singing traditional Christian hymns in perfect four-part harmony, accompanied by what sounded like an old pump organ. Initially, Sincere assumed the reports were cases of sound carrying farther than expected from one of the small churches that dotted the communities surrounding the refuge. Sound could travel extraordinary distances across water under the right atmospheric conditions, and it would not be unprecedented for nighttime services to be audible several miles away from their actual source. But when he consulted with local pastors and checked service schedules, he found that none of the area churches held midnight services, and all of the congregations had been accounted for during the times when the mysterious singing was reported. The reports became more frequent as autumn approached, and the descriptions grew increasingly detailed and disturbing. Campers spoke of feeling drawn to paddle toward the source of the singing, following the ethereal voices through narrow channels and round islands thick with Spanish moss, until they became completely disoriented in sections of the swamp they had never seen before. Several groups had to be rescued after spending entire nights lost in areas that did not appear on any official maps of the refuge. Waterways that seemed to exist only during the hours when the Phantom Choir performed its spectral concerts. As October arrived and the first cold fronts began to push through Georgia, Sincere decided he needed to investigate the phenomenon personally. He had explored every accessible section of the OK Feni during his years of service, but he realized there were still remote areas deep within the swamp's interior that he had never thoroughly surveyed. Armed with GPS equipment, camping supplies, and recording devices, he set out on a 3-day solo expedition to map the most isolated channels and document any unusual acoustic phenomena he might encounter. The first 2 nights of his investigation yielded nothing more unusual than the normal sounds of a healthy wetland ecosystem. He positioned himself at various locations throughout the remote sections of the refuge, recording hours of ambient sound, and carefully noting weather conditions, wind patterns, and other factors that might influence sound transmission across the water. His scientific approach to the mystery reflected his training in wildlife biology and his natural skepticism toward unexplained phenomena that usually had perfectly rational explanations once sufficient investigation was conducted. On the third night, positioned in a narrow channel, surrounded by towering bald cypress trees, whose trunks disappeared into darkness above his head, Sincere finally heard what the campers had been reporting. The singing began precisely at midnight, announced by the distant tolling of a church bell that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, voices raised in perfect harmony, singing amazing grace with a clarity and power that made his skin crawl with recognition of something fundamentally wrong about what he was experiencing. The voices were not coming from any single direction, but seemed to surround him completely, as if he were sitting in the center of a vast cathedral filled with an invisible congregation. The harmony was too perfect, each voice blending with the others in mathematical precision that spoke of centuries of practice, rather than the natural variations that characterized even the most accomplished human choirs. The accompanying organ music added another layer of impossibility, its rich tones resonating through the swamp air with a depth and complexity that required massive pipes and sophisticated mechanics to produce. Sincere activated his recording equipment and began documenting the phenomenon, but his digital recorder captured only silence despite the overwhelming volume of the singing that surrounded him. His backup analog tape recorder produced similar results, registering ambient swamp sounds, but no trace of the ethereal concert that was clearly audible to his ears. Even his smartphone's voice memo application failed to detect the phantom choir, though the singing was now loud enough that he had to raise his voice to be heard over the celestial harmony. As the choir moved from amazing grace into how great thou art, Sincere began to paddle toward what seemed to be the strongest concentration of voices. The singing guided him through channels he had never seen before, past islands that did not appear on his topographic maps into sections of the swamp that seemed older and more primordial than anything he had encountered in his years of exploration. The cypress trees here were enormous, their trunks easily 12 feet in diameter, suggesting ages that predated European colonization by centuries. The temperature dropped noticeably as he followed the phantom voices deeper into this unknown region of the refuge. His breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and a thin layer of ice began forming on the still water around his canoe. Despite the mild October weather that had characterized the day, Spanish moss hung from the ancient cypresses like frozen curtains, and the normal sounds of nighttime wildlife fell silent, as if the very presence of the spectral choir had commanded reverence from every living creature within hearing distance. Through the towering trees ahead, Sincere began to see a soft golden glow that seemed to emanate from some structure hidden among the massive trunks. As he paddled closer, the outline of a building became visible through the moss-draped branches, its architecture clearly dating from the early 19th century. It was a church, but one that defied every principle of physics and construction that should have governed structures built in wetland environments. The building appeared to be slowly sinking into the swamp, its foundation submerged beneath several feet of dark water, while its white painted walls and simple steeple rose defiantly into the Spanish moss canopy above. Warm light glowed from tall windows that should have been shattered by decades of weather and neglect, and the sound of the choir was now clearly coming from within the impossible structure. The phantom organ music resonated through the building's walls with such power that Sincere could feel the vibrations in his chest as he approached the partially submerged entrance. Against every instinct, screaming for him to retreat, Sincere secured his canoe to a cypress knee and waded through the knee-deep water toward the church's front door. The singing had moved into blessed assurance, performed with such technical perfection and emotional intensity The tears began streaming down his face. Despite his growing terror at what he was about to discover, his flashlight beam seemed weak and insufficient in the golden glow emanating from the church windows, but it revealed details that challenged his understanding of what was possible in the natural world. The church doors stood open, revealing an interior that was somehow completely dry, despite the building's obvious submersion in several feet of swamp water. Wooden pews filled with translucent figures faced a simple altar, where a robed pastor gestured with arms raised toward a cross that seemed to glow with its own internal light. The congregation was clearly visible, yet obviously not entirely present in any conventional sense, their forms shifting between solid appearance and transparent absence as they sang with voices that transcended human capability. At the ancient pump organ positioned to the right of the altar, sat a figure whose dedication to his musical ministry had apparently transcended the boundaries of mortality itself. The organist's fingers moved across the keys with practiced precision, drawing forth melodies that seemed to resonate not just through the air, but through the very fabric of reality. His form was more solid than the congregation, suggesting a stronger connection to the earthly realm and a more recent departure from the world of the living. As Sincere stood transfixed in the doorway, the pastor's eyes found his and held them with an intensity that spoke of profound sadness and eternal longing. The ghostly minister gestured for him to enter and join the eternal service, his mouth forming words of welcome that were lost in the overwhelming power of the choir's harmonies. The congregation turned as one to face the living visitor, their translucent faces showing expressions of joy at the prospect of a new member joining their endless worship. But the invitation carried with it an undertone of finality that penetrated Sincere's fascination with what he was witnessing. He realized that entering the church completely would mean joining the phantom congregation permanently, adding his voice to their eternal chorus and his form to their ghostly assembly. The warmth and acceptance emanating from the spectral worshippers was genuine and overwhelming, but it came with the price of abandoning the world of the living forever. Fighting against the profound sense of belonging that drew him toward the impossible sanctuary, Sincere forced himself to step backward into the cold swamp water. The moment his feet left the church's mysterious threshold, the singing began to fade, and the golden light dimmed noticeably. The congregation's faces registered disappointment and sadness as he continued his retreat, their forms becoming increasingly transparent as the connection between their realm and his weakened with distance. By the time he reached his canoe, the church had faded to nothing more than a faint glow among the cypress trees. The phantom choir performed one final hymn, "When We All Get to Heaven," before falling silent. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the temperature returned to normal, the ice melted from the water's surface, and the natural sounds of the swamp resumed as if nothing unusual had occurred. Sincere's GPS unit showed his location as coordinates that placed him in an area of open water with no land features whatsoever. Despite his clear memory of navigating through channels and around islands during his pursuit of the phantom voices, his detailed maps of the refuge showed no churches in any section of the wilderness area, historical or otherwise. Research into local records revealed that a small congregation had indeed established a church in the remote sections of what would later become the refuge. But the building had been lost when the Suwannee River changed course during the Great Flood of 1932, taking the entire community beneath the waters that still covered their final resting place. The reports of midnight singing continued throughout the remainder of October, but Sincere never again ventured into the deep swamp during the hours when the phantom congregation held their eternal services. He filed his official report as an investigation with inconclusive results. But he never forgot the profound sadness in the ghostly pastor's eyes, or the overwhelming sense of peace that had emanated from a congregation that refused to let death end their devotion to the divine mysteries they had worshipped in life. Crew Martinez had built his entire online presence around exploring places where most people would never dare to venture. His YouTube channel, Forgotten Depths, had amassed nearly 500,000 subscribers who tuned in religiously to watch him navigate abandoned hospitals, explore forgotten military installations, and document the slow decay of civilization's forgotten corners. At 26, he had developed a reputation for fearlessly investigating locations that other urban explorers avoided. Armed with professional camera equipment and a seemingly unshakable confidence in his ability to handle whatever mysteries he might uncover. The tip about the ancient cypress grove in East Texas had come from a subscriber who claimed to be a local hunter with decades of experience in the Big Thicket region. According to the email, there was a section of the preserve where trees had been growing for over 500 years, predating European settlement by centuries. The hunter claimed that Native American tribes had considered the grove sacred, a place where the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead was crossed. Spirits was thin enough for communication to occur between the two dimensions. What made the location particularly intriguing for Crew's purposes was the subscriber's assertion that the largest tree in the grove, a bald cypress with a trunk circumference of nearly 40 feet, had developed the ability to whisper the names of everyone who had died within its vicinity over the past 5 centuries. The hunter claimed that approaching the tree on certain nights would result in hearing a litany of names spoken in voices that belonged to the deceased themselves. A phenomenon that had driven away even the most experienced outdoorsmen who had encountered it. Crew spent 2 weeks researching the location, cross-referencing historical records with topographical maps and satellite imagery to identify the most likely coordinates for the grove described in the email. The Big Thicket National Preserve covered nearly 100,000 acres of diverse ecosystems, including sections that had never been thoroughly surveyed by modern researchers. Finding one specific grove within that vast wilderness would require careful planning and more than a little luck, but the potential for unique content made the effort worthwhile. His preparation for the expedition included not only his usual arsenal of cameras and audio recording equipment, but also research into the historical background of the region. The area had indeed been sacred to several Native American tribes, particularly the Atacapa and Caddo peoples, who had left behind numerous archaeological sites, indicating centuries of continuous habitation. European diseases and military campaigns had largely eliminated the indigenous population by the mid-1800s, leaving behind only scattered remnants of their culture and the oral traditions that spoke of special places where the natural and supernatural worlds intersected. The journey into the preserve began at dawn on a crisp October morning when the first cold front of autumn was pushing through East Texas. Crew loaded his gear into a lightweight canoe and launched from one of the designated access points, planning to follow a series of interconnected waterways deeper into the preserve than most visitors ever ventured. His GPS unit and compass would guide him to the approximate coordinates he had calculated, but finding the specific grove would require careful observation of the landscape and more than a little intuition. The first day of paddling took him through familiar territory that he had explored in previous videos. Pass by lined with tupelo trees, and through channels where alligators sun themselves on fallen logs with the casual indifference of apex predators secure in their domain. As he traveled deeper into the preserve, the waterways narrowed and the canopy overhead thickened, creating a tunnel-like environment where Spanish moss filtered the sunlight into a green twilight that persisted throughout the day. By evening, he had reached coordinates that placed him in the vicinity of where the ancient grove should be located. But the dense vegetation and uniform appearance of the swamp land made it difficult to identify specific landmarks. He made camp on a small island of higher ground, setting up his equipment to record the ambient sounds of the night while he reviewed his research notes and planned the next day's search pattern. It was during his second day of exploration, following a narrow channel that appeared on none of his maps, the crew first encountered the grove described in the subscriber's email. The transition from normal swamp land to the ancient forest was gradual but unmistakable. The trees grew larger and more widely spaced, their massive trunks speaking of centuries of uninterrupted growth in conditions that had remained largely unchanged since before recorded history began in the region. The centerpiece of the grove was indeed a bald cypress of extraordinary size. Its trunk so massive that crew estimated it would take at least 8 people holding hands to encircle its circumference. The tree rose perhaps 120 feet into the canopy, its branches spreading in all directions to create a natural cathedral beneath its ancient arms. Spanish moss hung from every branch like prayer flags left by generations of pilgrims, and the base of the trunk showed clear evidence of human interaction spanning centuries. Carved symbols covered the lower portion of the great tree's bark, some clearly of Native American origin, while others appeared to be more recent additions left by visitors who had found this sacred place over the decades. Names and dates stretch back to the early 1800s, carved by pioneers, soldiers, and settlers who had encountered the ancient giant during their travels through the wilderness. But it was the hollow at the base of the tree that drew crew's immediate attention and filled him with the first stirrings of unease about what he might have discovered. The cavity in the tree's trunk was easily large enough for a person to enter, its interior worn smooth by centuries of weather and the passage of countless hands. But the hollow was not empty. Instead, it contained what appeared to be a museum of human artifacts spanning 5 centuries, carefully arranged and preserved despite the humid conditions that should have destroyed organic materials within decades of their placement in the tree's protection. There were arrowheads and pottery fragments that clearly predated European contact. Their craftsmanship. Speaking of the skilled artisans who had created them for purposes, both practical and ceremonial, Spanish coins and religious medals told the story of early explorers who had passed through this region centuries before it appeared on any official maps. Personal effects from the American colonial period included everything from children's toys to wedding rings, each item representing someone who had lived, loved, and ultimately died within the influence of the great tree's ancient presence. More disturbing were the items of recent origin that had somehow found their way into the collection. Driver's licenses with photos that showed smiling faces now decades deceased, military dog tags from conflicts spanning from World War II to Afghanistan, and cell phones whose owners had vanished without trace in the trackless wilderness of the preserve. More disturbing were the items of recent origin that had somehow found their way into the collection. Driver's licenses with photos that showed smiling faces now decades deceased, military dog tags from conflicts spanning from World War II to Afghanistan, and cell phones whose owners had vanished without trace in the trackless wilderness of the preserve. Through his headphones, he could hear a constant low-level whisper that seemed to emanate from the tree itself. A sound so faint that it was almost below the threshold of perception, but persistent enough to create an unsettling background to his investigation. The whispers were not random sounds, but clearly formed words, though spoken so softly that individual names remained indistinct. The sun was beginning to set when the whispering suddenly intensified, becoming clearly audible without the aid of electronic amplification. The voices were speaking names just as the subscriber had described, but not in any single language or accent. Instead, the litany included names from every culture and time period that had intersected with this ancient place over the past 5 centuries. Native American names in languages that had been extinct for generations, mixed with Spanish and French appellations, left by early European explorers, followed by English names that told the story of American expansion into the Texas wilderness. Oh, what made the experience truly terrifying was the realization that each name was spoken in the voice of the person it represented, as if the tree had somehow captured not just their identity, but the actual sound of their final words before death claimed them. Children's voices called out in languages their descendants had forgotten, while the elderly whispered their names with the accumulated wisdom of lifetimes spent in harmony with the natural world that had ultimately reclaimed them. As darkness fell completely, the whispering voices grew more insistent and began to include names that Crew recognized from recent missing person reports he had researched during his preparation for the expedition. Hikers who had vanished without trace in the preserve, hunters who had never returned from solo expeditions, and researchers who had disappeared while conducting studies in the most remote sections of the Big Thicket. Each name was accompanied by a brief glimpse of the person it represented. Shadowy figures that appeared at the edge of vision before dissolving back into the darkness between the ancient trees. The tree's hollow began to glow with a soft phosphorescent light that revealed details Crew had not noticed during his daylight investigation. The artifacts within the cavity were not randomly arranged, but formed intricate patterns that seemed to tell the story of human interaction with this place across centuries of continuous habitation and visitation. Wedding rings formed circles within circles, while military medals created geometric designs that spoke of lives given in service to causes larger than individual survival. Children's toys were arranged in playful scenes that suggested innocent games continuing beyond the boundary of mortality. But it was the most recent addition to the collection that made Crew's blood run cold with recognition of his own mortality. His driver's license, clearly visible among the other modern artifacts, despite the fact that he was certain it remained securely in his wallet, bore his photograph and information with devastating clarity. The implications of its presence in the tree's hollow were impossible to ignore, even as his rational mind struggled to find explanations that did not require, accepting that his own death had somehow been predetermined by forces beyond human understanding. The whispered names now included his own, spoken in his own voice, with a tone of resigned acceptance that suggested he had already acknowledged his fate and made peace with the ancient powers that governed this sacred grove. Other voices began calling his name as well, inviting him to join their eternal congregation, to add his story to the centuries of human experience that the great tree had witnessed and preserved within its hollow heart. Fighting against a growing compulsion to remain in the grove and accept whatever destiny awaited him, Crew forced himself to pack his equipment and retreat to his canoe. The whispered names followed him through the darkness, growing fainter with distance, but never completely fading as he navigated by moonlight through channels that seemed to shift and change with each passing hour. His GPS unit showed his location as constantly moving, despite his certainty that he was following the same waterway that had brought him to the grove. When dawn finally broke and he emerged from the preserve at a boat launch he did not remember using during his entry. Crew discovered that his camera equipment had captured nothing from his time in the grove. The memory cards contained hours of footage showing only normal swamp scenery with no trace of the ancient cypress or its impossible collection of artifacts. His audio recordings contained only the ambient sounds of a healthy wetland ecosystem, with no hint of the whispered names that had driven him from the sacred place in terror. But his driver's license was missing from his wallet, and he never returned to the big thicket, despite the hundreds of comments from subscribers demanding to know why he had never produced a video about the expedition. The ancient cypress continues its patient vigil, adding names to its whispered litany and artifacts to its hollow heart, preserving the memory of all who have lived and died within its vast sphere of influence across the centuries of human history that have passed beneath its ancient branches. Journey Thompson had been guiding nighttime swamp tours through the wetlands of Alabama's Mobile Bay for 8 years, and she thought she had seen every phenomenon that these ancient waters could produce. Her business, Midnight Bayou Adventures, specialized in providing tourists with authentic experiences of Southern Gothic atmosphere, complete with stories of local legends and carefully orchestrated encounters with the wildlife that made the coastal swamps their home. At 31, she had perfected the art of balancing genuine education about wetland ecosystems with just enough supernatural folklore to keep her customers entertained and coming back for repeat visits. Her tours typically launched from a small marina near Spanish Fort, following well-established routes through the maze of channels that connected Mobile Bay with the vast network of rivers and creeks that drained into the Gulf of Mexico. The area was rich in history, from Native American settlements that predated European contact to Civil War fortifications, and the remains of early industrial operations that had shaped the development of the entire region. Jury had researched every story, verified every historical claim, and could recite the documented facts behind the legends that tourists expected to hear during their nighttime adventures. But the phenomenon that began appearing during the unusually foggy autumn of her 9th year in business challenged every rational explanation she had developed for the strange occurrences that occasionally punctuated her tours. It started with subtle changes in the behavior of her regular customers, experienced local residents who had taken multiple tours and knew what to expect from their familiar journey through the darkened wetlands. They began reporting sounds and sights that did not match anything in Journey's carefully planned presentations, experiences that left them shaken and reluctant to discuss what they had witnessed. The first concrete sighting occurred during a tour in late September when a thick fog bank rolled in from the Gulf of Mexico and reduced visibility to less than 20 feet in any direction. Jury had encountered similar weather conditions many times before and knew how to navigate safely using GPS and her intimate knowledge of channel markers and natural landmarks. But as she guided her group of 12 tourists through the narrow waterways near the ruins of Fort Morgan, her passengers began pointing excitedly at something moving parallel to their route through the impenetrable mist. Through the fog came the unmistakable sound of an airboat, its distinctive aircraft engine and propeller creating a rhythmic whine that every resident of the Gulf Coast could identify from miles away. The sound was moving at considerable speed, suggesting an operator with expert knowledge of these treacherous waters and complete confidence in navigating through conditions that would challenge even experienced pilots. But there was something wrong with the engine noise, something that made Jury's skin crawl with recognition of a sound that belonged to a different era of mechanical engineering. The engine note was too deep, too rough, lacking the refined precision of modern airboat motors that had been engineered for efficiency and noise reduction. Instead, it sounded like the primitive aircraft engines that had powered the first generation of swamp boats, machines that had been built during the 1940s and 1950s when noise and fuel consumption were secondary concerns to raw power and mechanical reliability. The sound triggered memories from her childhood when her grandfather had operated similar equipment, but those vintage engines had been retired decades ago in favor of modern alternatives. As the phantom airboat passed closer to their position, Journey caught glimpses of its outline through breaks in the fog. The vessel was clearly of antique design, its hull constructed from wood and metal in the distinctive profile that characterized airboats from the immediate post-war period. But most disturbing was the figure at the controls, a man wearing clothing that seemed to belong to the 1960s. His posture and movement suggesting someone engaged in desperate searching rather than casual navigation through familiar waters. The phantom pilot seemed to be scanning the water's surface with systematic intensity, turning his head from side to side in patterns that suggested he was looking for something specific that remained perpetually just beyond his ability to locate. His movements were mechanical and repetitive, lacking the natural variations that would characterize normal human behavior. As if he had been performing the same search pattern for so many years that it had become an automatic response, divorced from conscious thought or hope of success. Journey's tourists were captivated by this unexpected addition to their swamp tour, assuming it was part of her carefully orchestrated presentation designed to enhance their Gothic atmosphere experience. She played along with their assumptions while privately noting details that challenged her understanding of what was possible in these waters. The phantom airboat left no wake despite its obvious speed, made no disturbance in the fog pattern, despite the powerful downdraft that should have been generated by its propeller, and produced no reflected light from her tour boat's powerful spotlights, despite being clearly visible through the mist. The encounter lasted perhaps 10 minutes before the phantom vessel disappeared completely, its engine noise fading to silence so gradually that Juror could not identify the exact moment when it stopped being audible. Her tourists discussed the experience enthusiastically for the remainder of the tour, praising her creativity in arranging such a realistic historical reenactment to complement her traditional stories about Civil War ghosts and Native American spirits. She accepted their compliments without correcting their assumptions, but privately began researching the possible explanations for what she had witnessed. The phenomenon repeated itself during subsequent tours, always under conditions of heavy fog when visibility was severely limited, but never following any predictable schedule that would allow Journey to prepare her customers for the encounter. The phantom airboat appeared perhaps once every 3 or 4 tours, always following the same general search pattern through the wetlands near Fort Morgan, always piloted by the same figure in vintage clothing, who seemed eternally engaged in looking for something that remained perpetually beyond his reach. Research into local maritime records revealed that an airboat operator named Harold Duchenne had indeed disappeared in these waters during the summer of 1967. According to newspaper accounts and Coast Guard reports, Duchenne had been searching for his 8-year-old daughter Sarah, who had vanished while playing near the water during a family camping trip on one of the barrier islands. Despite extensive search efforts involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups, neither Sarah nor her father had ever been found, leaving behind only Harold's abandoned truck at the boat launch, and Sarah's small shoes discovered on the beach where she had last been seen. The investigation into their disappearance had consumed weeks of intensive effort with search teams combing every accessible section of the wetlands and dragging the deeper channels for any trace of the missing father and daughter. Harold had been described as an expert pilot with decades of experience navigating the treacherous waters around Mobile Bay. Someone who knew every hidden sandbar and underwater obstacle that could pose a threat to unwary boers. His disappearance while engaged in searching for his daughter had been considered especially tragic because his expertise should have made him virtually immune to the hazards that claimed less experienced operators. As autumn progressed, and the fog banks became more frequent, Jury began to notice additional details about the phantom airboat that made the encounters increasingly disturbing. The vintage vessel appeared to be showing signs of long immersion in salt water. Its metal components corroded by decades of exposure to the harsh marine environment. The wooden portions of the hull had taken on the gray-green color characteristic of timber that had spent years underwater, while Spanish moss seemed to be growing from various points along its structure, despite the impossibility of such vegetation surviving in a moving vehicle. The pilot himself began to show similar signs of aquatic decay, his clothing hanging in tatters that suggested long submersion followed by repeated exposure to sun and salt air. His movements became increasingly erratic as the encounters continued, his systematic search pattern deteriorating into desperate random changes of direction that spoke of growing frustration and mounting desperation. Sometimes Jury could see him calling out across the water, his mouth forming words that were lost in the sound of his vintage engine, but whose meaning was clear from the anguish expressed in his posture and gestures. The most disturbing encounter occurred during a tour in early November when the fog was so thick that Jury could barely see her own bow from her position at the steering console. The phantom airboat appeared directly ahead of her tour group, forcing her to cut power and drift to avoid a collision with the spectral vessel. For several minutes, both boats maintained parallel courses through the mist. Close enough the journey could clearly observe the phantom pilot's deteriorated condition and hear his desperate calls for his missing daughter. Harold Duchen's voice, distorted by decades of supernatural existence, but still recognizably human, echoed across the dark water as he called Sarah's name with the anguished persistence of a father whose love had transcended death itself. His phantom airboat circled Journey's tour group repeatedly, the pilot scanning their faces with desperate hope that somehow his daughter might be among the living passengers who had ventured into his eternal searching grounds. The tourists, initially entertained by what they assumed was an elaborate performance, gradually fell silent as the true nature of what they were witnessing became impossible to ignore. When the fog finally lifted near midnight, revealing clear skies and calm water, the phantom airboat had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. But floating in the water, where the spectral vessel had last been seen, Jury discovered a small pink shoe that matched the description of the footwear Sarah Duchesne had been wearing on the day she disappeared 57 years earlier. The shoe was in perfect condition despite its impossible age, as if it had been preserved by the same supernatural forces that allowed Harold's continued search for his lost daughter. Jury never reported the discovery of Sarah's shoe to authorities, knowing that no rational explanation could account for its presence in waters that had been thoroughly searched decades earlier. Instead, she placed it carefully in a waterproof container and returned it to the location where she had found it. Understanding instinctively that removing the artifact might somehow interfere with Harold's eternal quest to reunite with the daughter he had failed to save during his lifetime. The phantom airboat continues to appear during foggy nights around Mobile Bay, its vintage engine announcing Harold Duchesne's ongoing search for Sarah. While tourists mistake his supernatural presence for entertainment designed to enhance their swamp tour experience, Jury has learned to recognize the atmospheric conditions that precede his appearances. But she never warns her customers about what they might encounter, allowing them to draw their own conclusions about whether they are witnessing careful staging or something that exists beyond the boundaries of rational explanation. Some mysteries are better left undisturbed, and some searches are meant to continue beyond the limits of mortal life, sustained by love so powerful that death itself cannot bring them to an end. Jovi Blackwood had dedicated her graduate studies at the University of Michigan to documenting the folklore traditions of Native American tribes throughout the Great Lakes region, with particular focus on how ancient stories reflected actual environmental phenomena that modern science was only beginning to understand. As a doctoral candidate in cultural anthropology, she had spent 3 years collecting oral histories from tribal elders, cross-referencing their accounts with geological surveys, and developing theories about how indigenous knowledge systems had preserved accurate observations about natural processes for centuries before European scientific methods arrived in North America. The research that brought her to the Canoe National Wildlife Refuge in Michigan's Upper Peninsula had grown out of interviews she had conducted with Ojibwe elders from the nearby reservation who spoke of lights that danced above certain bog areas during specific times of the year. According to their traditional accounts, these lights marked the locations where their ancestors had been forced to abandon the bodies of loved ones during the traumatic relocations of the 1800s, when government policies had driven entire communities from their ancestral lands with such haste that proper burial ceremonies could not be performed. The elders described the bog lights as spirits of the unburied dead, restless souls who continued to seek the traditional funeral rites that would allow them to find peace in the afterlife. The lights appeared most frequently during the autumn months when the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was traditionally considered to be at its thinnest, and they were said to respond to human presence with intelligence and purpose, rather than following random patterns that might characterize natural phosphorescence or atmospheric phenomena. Jovi had initially approached these accounts with the academic skepticism that characterized modern folklore studies, viewing them as metaphorical representations of historical trauma rather than literal descriptions of supernatural events. But her research into the historical record had revealed documentation of forced relocations that matched the tribal accounts with disturbing accuracy, including government reports that mentioned the difficulties of transporting elderly and sick community members across vast distances during harsh weather conditions. The specific bog area described in the oral histories was located deep within the sea refuge, accessible only by following a network of old logging roads that had been largely reclaimed by wilderness since the timber industry abandoned the region in the early 1900s. According to the tribal elders, the lights appeared most reliably during the weeks surrounding the autumn equinox when atmospheric conditions and seasonal changes created optimal circumstances for the spiritual manifestations they had observed for generations. Joy's first expedition to the remote bog was planned as a simple overnight observation session equipped with cameras, audio recording devices, and scientific instruments that might help her document any unusual phenomena while maintaining the objective distance required for academic research. She had received permission from tribal authorities to conduct her study with the understanding that her work would contribute to preserving traditional knowledge systems that were in danger of being lost as older generations passed away without finding receptive audiences for their ancient wisdom. The hike to the bog required most of the daylight hours, following faint trails through dense forests of cedar and tamarack that has grown wild since the logging era ended. The landscape showed clear evidence of past industrial activity with rusted equipment and abandoned rail grades serving as reminders of the brief period when this wilderness had been subjected to intensive resource extraction. But nature had reclaimed most traces of human interference, creating an environment that felt primordial and timeless despite its relatively recent history of exploitation. The bog itself was larger than Jovi had expected. Perhaps 2 acres of open wetland surrounded by a buffer of stunted trees and dense undergrowth that created natural barriers to casual exploration. The water was dark with tannins, stained the color of strong tea by centuries of organic decomposition, and dotted with islands of sphagnum moss that supported specialized plant communities adapted to the acidic conditions. Standing at the edge of this ancient landscape, Jovi could understand how indigenous peoples might have viewed such places as threshold environments where the normal rules of existence became flexible and permeable. As sunset approached, she established her observation post on a small rise that provided clear views across the entire bog, while offering some protection from the evening mist that was already beginning to form above the dark water. Her scientific equipment detected normal background readings for temperature, humidity, and electromagnetic activity, providing baseline measurements against which any unusual phenomena could be compared. The silence of the bog was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a loon or the splash of a beaver working somewhere in the darkness beyond her vision. The lights began to appear just as the last traces of daylight faded from the western sky. Starting as faint glimmers barely distinguishable from fireflies or the reflection of stars on the water's surface. But as darkness deepened, the illumination intensified and began to display characteristics that challenged every natural explanation Jovi could conceive. The lights moved with apparent purpose, rather than drifting randomly, forming patterns that seemed to respond to her presence and react to her movements with what could only be described as awareness. There were dozens of them, perhaps as many as 50 individual lights scattered across the bog's surface, each one maintaining a distinct position relative to the others, while participating in larger choreographed movements that created shifting geometric patterns above the dark water. The colors ranged from pale blue-white to deeper golden hues with occasional flashes of green and purple that added complexity to the ethereal display. But most unsettling was the way the lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with each other, as if they were connected by some invisible communication network that allowed coordinated behavior. Through her telephoto lens, Joy could see that each light appeared to be centered above what looked like slight depressions in the bog's surface, areas where the sphagnum moss had grown in circular patterns that suggested underlying disturbances in the normal substrate. The historical accounts she had researched mentioned that bodies had been placed in shallow graves, hastily dug in whatever ground was available, often in wetland areas where the acidic soil conditions might preserve remains for extended periods, while preventing the decomposition that would normally return organic matter to the natural cycle. As the night progressed, the lights began to form more complex patterns that seemed deliberately designed to convey information to any observer capable of interpreting their movements. Groups of lights would gather in circular formations before dispersing in radiating lines that pointed towards specific locations around the bog's perimeter. Individual lights would rise higher above the water's surface, becoming brighter and more defined before descending back to their original positions, as if calling attention to their particular locations for reasons that remained hidden from outside understanding. Joy's audio recording equipment began picking up sounds that were not audible to her unadded ears. Low-frequency vibrations that resolved into what could only be described as voices speaking in languages she could not identify, but which carried emotional undertones of profound sadness and desperate longing. The voices seemed to be calling out names both in native languages and in the English that had been imposed on indigenous communities during the forced assimilation programs of the late 1800s. Children's voices mixed with those of elders, creating a chorus of the displaced and forgotten that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The temperature around her observation post began to drop noticeably despite the mild autumn weather, and her breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air that seemed to emanate from the bog itself, rather than descending from the atmosphere above. The scientific instruments that had been recording normal readings throughout the evening began to register anomalous data with electromagnetic detectors showing massive fluctuations that corresponded exactly with the movements of the lights across the water's surface. But it was the response of the lights to her own presence that transformed Joy's academic interest into something approaching terror. When she moved her position to get better camera angles, the entire display would shift to maintain focus on her location, as if the spiritual manifestations were as interested in observing her as she was in documenting their behavior. Individual lights would approach her position directly, hovering just beyond the reach of her equipment while pulsing with increased intensity that seemed to convey urgent attempts at communication. Through her camera's LCD screen, Joy began to see figures materializing around each light source. Translucent forms that appeared to be people of various ages dressed in traditional Native American clothing from the historical period of the forced relocations. Men, women, children, and elderly individuals stood above the bog surface. Their faces turned toward her observation post with expressions of desperate hope that seemed to recognize her as someone who might be able to help them achieve the peace that had been denied to them for over a century. The figures began to move toward her position. Walking across the bog's surface as if it were solid ground, their footsteps creating ripples in the dark water that spread outward in perfect circles. They were calling to her in languages she could not understand, but which conveyed meanings that transcended verbal communication, reaching directly into her consciousness with requests for assistance that spoke to fundamental human needs for dignity, respect, and proper recognition of their suffering. As the spiritual procession approached the edge of the bog, where Jovi had established her observation post, she realized that they were offering to share their stories with her, to provide first-hand accounts of the historical trauma that had created their restless condition, and the specific circumstances that had prevented them from receiving the burial rites that their cultural traditions required for peaceful transition to the afterlife. But accepting their offer would mean crossing into their realm permanently, becoming part of their eternal vigil rather than simply documenting it from the safety of academic distance, fighting against an overwhelming compulsion to join the spirits in their bog-bound existence. Joy forced herself to pack her equipment and retreat from the observation post. The lights followed her progress through the forest for several miles, visible through the trees as she navigated by flashlight back toward the logging roads that would lead her to safety. Their glow gradually faded with distance, but their voices continued to call her name long after their illumination had disappeared, speaking it in languages both ancient and modern, as if trying every possible means of maintaining the connection she had established through her respectful attention to their plight. The bog lights continue to appear during autumn nights in the Seni refuge, marking the locations where indigenous peoples were forced to abandon their dead during one of the darkest chapters in American history. Joy's research has been incorporated into tribal efforts to document historical trauma and advocate for recognition of the suffering experienced by Native communities during the forced relocation period. But she has never returned to the remote bog, knowing that some knowledge comes with obligations that extend far beyond academic curiosity and into realms where the living must choose between preservation of scholarship and preservation of their own souls. Anakin Rivers had been leading kayak expeditions through South Carolina's ACE Basin for over a decade, but the overnight camping trip he organized during the exceptionally low tide of October 2023 would challenge everything he thought he understood about the coastal wilderness he had called home for his entire 38 years. As the owner of Low Country Paddle Adventures, He had guided thousands of visitors through the pristine salt marshes and tidal creeks that formed one of the largest undeveloped estuarine systems on the Atlantic coast. Sharing his intimate knowledge of an ecosystem that existed in constant flux between fresh and salt water, land and sea, past and present. The group he was leading on this particular expedition consisted of 8 experienced kayakers who had specifically requested a challenging multi-day journey through the most remote sections of the basin. Areas that few commercial outfitters were willing to access due to the complex tidal patterns and navigation hazards that could trap unwary paddlers miles from the nearest road or rescue point. These were serious outdoor enthusiasts who had paddled wilderness areas throughout North America and were seeking an authentic encounter with one of the last truly wild places on the eastern seaboard. The timing of their trip had been planned to coincide with a series of exceptionally low tides that occurred only a few times each year, when the gravitational pull of the new moon combined with seasonal weather patterns to drop water levels far below their normal range. These extreme low tides revealed sections of the estuary floor that were normally submerged beneath several feet of water, creating temporary islands and exposing features of the landscape that had been hidden for decades or even centuries. Anakin had paddled during similar tide conditions before and knew that the experience would provide his guests with unique opportunities to observe archaeological sites, fossil beds, and geological formations that were invisible during normal water levels. The Ace Basin had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. First by Native American tribes who had left behind shell mittens and fishing wares, then by European colonists who had established rice plantations along the tidal rivers, and finally by African Amiens who had developed distinctive Gula communities that maintained cultural traditions dating back to their West African origins. The first day of their expedition proceeded according to plan, with the group paddling through familiar channels, while Anakin pointed out historical sites and explained the complex ecological relationships that made the basin such an important habitat for migratory birds, marine mammals, and countless species of fish and shellfish. They made camp on a large hammock that provided elevated ground above the high tide line, surrounded by ancient live oaks whose branches formed a natural canopy decorated with Spanish moss and resurrection ferns. It was during the second day, as they explored a section of the Canoe River that Anakin had never previously accessed due to shallow water conditions, that they made the discovery that would transform their wilderness adventure into something far more disturbing than any of them had anticipated. The extreme low tide had dropped the water level to a point where the river resembled a narrow creek, winding between exposed mud flats that revealed the underlying topography of a landscape that had been submerged for nearly a century and a half. Protruding from what should have been the river bottom, arranged in orderly rows that spoke of human planning and intention, were dozens of weathered headstones and grave markers that had been underwater since the catastrophic flood of 1889, when a dam failure had permanently altered the drainage patterns of the entire region. The cemetery had been lost to rising water levels that followed the engineering disaster, its location forgotten as the displaced families scattered to other communities, and the memory of their ancestors' burial sites gradually faded from living memory. But the extreme low tide had revealed not just the headstones, but the entire layout of what had once been a substantial community cemetery, complete with family plots delineated by iron fencing that had somehow resisted decades of submersion in salt water. The grave markers bore names and dates that told the story of a thriving antebellum community with birth years stretching back to the late 1700s, and death dates clustering around the 1850s and 1860s. when disease epidemics and the Civil War had taken their toll on the local population. Anakin guided his group carefully between the exposed grave sites, mindful of the respect due to what was clearly a sacred space that had been hidden beneath the waters for generations. Several of his clients were amateur genealogists who began photographing the headstones and recording the names and dates for later research, hoping to connect the forgotten cemetery with historical records that might shed light on the community that had once thrived in this now isolated section of the coastal wilderness. As the afternoon progressed and the tide reached its lowest point, even more of the cemetery became visible, revealing details that suggested this had been no ordinary burial ground, but rather a site of particular significance to the community it had served. At the center of the exposed area stood an elaborate mausoleum constructed from local stone, its architecture indicating considerable expense and craftsmanship that spoke of wealth and social prominence. Carved symbols on the mausoleum's facade included both Christian imagery and decorative elements that seemed to incorporate African cultural motifs, suggesting the complex cultural mixing that had characterized Low Country society during the antebellum period. But it was as evening approached and the group prepared to make camp on higher ground that the truly disturbing aspects of their discovery began to manifest. As twilight deepened over the exposed cemetery, Anakin noticed movement among the headstones that could not be explained by the gentle current of the shallow water that still flowed around the bases of the grave markers. Shadowy figures seemed to be walking between the rows of graves, their forms barely visible in the gathering darkness, but clearly human in shape and movement. The figures appeared to be dressed in clothing from the mid-1800s, with women in long dresses and men in formal suits that suggested they were attending some kind of ceremonial gathering among the graves of their former community. They moved with the slow, measured pace of people participating in a solemn ritual, pausing at individual headstones, as if paying respects to specific individuals whose names and life stories were known to them through personal relationships that transcended the boundaries between life and death. As full darkness settled over the flooded cemetery, the phantom congregation grew more distinct and numerous. With dozens of translucent figures appearing among the exposed grave sites, they seemed to be organizing themselves for some kind of service or ceremony, gathering in groups around the central mausoleum, while individual figures took positions that suggested specific roles in whatever ritual they were preparing to perform. The scene had the organized quality of a church service, with clear distinctions between participants and observers, leaders and congregation members. Then carried across the water with impossible clarity, despite the lack of any visible source, came the sound of church bells ringing in slow, measured tolls that marked the beginning of what could only be described as a funeral service being conducted by and for the dead themselves. The phantom congregation fell silent as the bells continued their solemn announcement, their translucent forms turning toward the mausoleum, where a figure in clerical robes had appeared to conduct whatever ceremony was about to unfold in this impossible gathering of spirits from a forgotten past. Anakin's clients huddled closer together in their kayaks, no longer interested in photographing the historical discovery they had made, but instead focused on the growing realization that they were witnessing something that challenged every rational explanation they might have constructed for what was unfolding before their eyes. The water around them had become unnaturally still, creating perfect reflections of the phantom figures that made it impossible to distinguish between the spirits themselves and their mirror images on the water's surface. The ghostly minister began to speak, his words carrying across the water with perfect clarity despite the distance and the atmospheric conditions that should have muffled any sound to unintelligible whispers. He was conducting a funeral service, but not for any single individual. Instead, his sermon seemed to address the entire community that had been disrupted by the flood of 1889, acknowledging the trauma of displacement and the pain of separation from the sacred ground where their mortal remains had been laid to rest according to the customs and beliefs that had given meaning to their lives. The congregation responded with hymns that filled the night air with harmonies that spoke of profound faith maintained despite catastrophic loss. Their voices rose and fell in traditional spirituals that combined Christian theology with African musical traditions, creating a sound that was both hauntingly beautiful and deeply unsettling in its context of a worship service being conducted by people who had been dead for over a century. The music seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding Anakin's group with ethereal melodies that penetrated their consciousness with emotional intensity that brought tears to their eyes. As the phantom service continued, the water level around the cemetery began to rise with the incoming tide, gradually covering the lower headstones and forcing the living kayakers to paddle backward to maintain their distance from the sacred space. But rather than dispersing as their burial ground disappeared beneath the water, the ghostly congregation seemed to gain strength and definition as the familiar conditions of submersion returned to their eternal resting place. The spirits began to walk on the water's surface as their graves disappeared beneath the rising tide, their forms becoming more solid and distinct as they adapted to the aquatic environment that had become their permanent home. They continued their worship service while standing or kneeling on the water itself, their phantom church bells continuing to toll beneath the surface with a sound that resonated through the water and into the holes of the kayaks where Anakin and his clients listened in stunned silence. The underwater bells were joined by other sounds that seemed to emanate from the submerged cemetery. Organ music played on instruments that had been destroyed by decades of submersion. Choir voices singing from beneath the water's surface, and the rustle of clothing and movement of feet on ground that existed in some dimension parallel to but separate from the physical world that Anakin understood. The entire flooded cemetery had become a congregation space where the normal rules of physics and mortality had been suspended in favor of spiritual realities that transcended the limitations of earthly existence. As the tide continued to rise, and the phantom congregation adapted to their underwater sanctuary, Anakin realized that his group had witnessed not just a historical curiosity exposed by unusual natural conditions, but an ongoing spiritual community that had maintained its religious practices. Despite the catastrophic flooding that had scattered their mortal remains and obliterated their physical place of worship, the dead had simply adapted their customs to their new aquatic environment, continuing their faith traditions beneath the waters that covered their graves. The experience lasted until dawn, when the rising sun gradually dissolved the phantom congregation back into the depths of the flooded cemetery. The church bells fell silent. The ethereal hymn singing faded away, and the water returned to its normal appearance of a tidal creek flowing through coastal marsh grass. But Anakin and his clients had been forever changed by their encounter with a community of faith that had proven stronger than death itself, maintaining their spiritual connections despite physical separation from the sacred ground where their bodies had been laid to rest according to the customs of their living years. The extreme low tide that had revealed the sunken cemetery was not repeated during Anakin's remaining years of guiding expeditions through the ACC Basin, and the location of the underwater burial ground gradually faded from the GPS coordinates he had recorded during that extraordinary night. But local watermen sometimes report hearing church bells ringing beneath the water during certain tide conditions, and the faint sound of him singing carried on evening breezes that blow across the coastal marshes where the faithful continue their eternal worship in sanctuaries that exist beyond the reach of earthly understanding. Indy Martinez had dedicated her career to documenting endangered species in remote wilderness areas where few other wildlife videographers dared to venture. At 29, she had already produced award-winning documentaries about wolves in Alaska, snow leopards in the Himalayas, and jaguars in the Amazon rainforest, earning a reputation for her ability to capture intimate footage of creatures that had learned to avoid human contact through centuries of persecution. Her latest assignment had brought her to the northern forests of Minnesota, where she was working on a project for the National Geographic Society, documenting the last remnants of the pristine boreal ecosystem that had once covered vast portions of North America. The subject of her current documentation was a small population of woodland caribou that had somehow survived in the remote lakes and bogs of the Boundary Waters Canoe area. Despite being officially extinct in the region for over a century, recent trail camera images from researchers studying wolf populations had captured what appeared to be caribou tracks and droppings, leading to speculation that a small herd might have migrated south from Canada and established itself in the most inaccessible sections of the wilderness area, where human intrusion was minimal and traditional prey species had been depleted by climate change and habitat fragmentation. The location where she had established her filming position was a place local Ojibwe guides called Lost Lake, though it appeared on no official maps of the region and could only be reached by following a series of increasingly narrow waterways that required expert navigation skills and intimate knowledge of the seasonal water level fluctuations that could make previously passable routes impassable within a matter of days. Indy had hired Robert Kingbird, a traditional Ojibwe outdoorsman whose family had hunted and fished in these waters for generations, to guide her to the remote lake and provide cultural context for the spiritual significance that indigenous peoples attached to this particular section of the northern wilderness. Robert had been reluctant to take her to Lost Lake, explaining that his grandfather and other tribal elders had always spoken of the area as a place where the normal rules governing the behavior of animals did not apply, where spirits could take physical form, and where the boundaries between species became fluid and unpredictable. According to traditional stories, Lost Lake was home to beings that could assume the appearance of any animal they chose, using these disguises to observe human behavior and test the intentions of those who ventured into their sacred territory. But Indy's persistence and her genuine respect for indigenous knowledge systems had eventually convinced Robert to serve as her guide, with the understanding that their expedition would be conducted according to traditional protocols that required specific offerings to be made to the spirits of the lake and absolute honesty about their intentions in entering the sacred space. She had agreed to these conditions not out of belief in their supernatural significance, but from recognition that respecting local customs was essential for maintaining the collaborative relationships that made her work possible. The journey to Lost Lake required 2 days of paddling through increasingly narrow channels that wound through dense stands of black spruce and tamarack, past beaver dams that created natural steps in the water level, and around islands covered with ancient white pines that had somehow escaped the logging operations that had cleared most of the original forest. During the early 1900s, the landscape grew more primordial with each mile they traveled, taking on characteristics that spoke of an ecosystem that had remained largely unchanged since the retreat of the glaciers 10,000 years earlier. Lost Lake itself was smaller than Indy had expected, perhaps half a mile across at its widest point, surrounded by low hills covered with dense forest that created a natural amphitheater around the dark water. The lake was fed by underground springs that kept the water exceptionally clear, despite the tannins that should have stained it brown like most northern bog lakes. Ancient petroglyphs on exposed granite outcroppings around the shoreline testified to centuries of indigenous use, with symbols depicting various animals and human figures engaged in activities that seemed to blend hunting ceremony and spiritual transformation. Indy established her filming position on a small island near the center of the lake, using camouflaged blinds and remote cameras to document any wildlife activity without disturbing the natural behavior of the animals she hoped to observe. Her equipment included motion-activated night vision cameras, telephoto lenses capable of capturing detailed footage from extreme distances, and audio recording devices sensitive enough to pick up animal vocalizations from across the lake. Robert made camp on the mainland, following traditional practices that required maintaining respectful distance from the sacred center of the lake, while remaining close enough to provide assistance if needed. The first 3 days of observation yielded typical footage of northern wilderness wildlife: black bears foraging for blueberries along the shoreline, loons diving for fish in the deeper sections of the lake, and a variety of waterfowl that use the isolated waters as a resting place during their autumn migration. Indy captured beautiful footage of the pristine ecosystem, but nothing that suggested the presence of the woodland caribou that had supposedly been spotted in the region. It was on the 4th evening, as the sun was setting behind the forested hills that surrounded Lost Lake, that Indy first observed the creature that would challenge every scientific principle she had ever accepted about animal behavior and evolutionary biology. Through her telephoto lens, she watched what appeared to be a large moose emerging from the forest on the far side of the lake. Its massive antlers and distinctive profile clearly visible against the darkening tree line. But as she observed the animal more carefully, Indy began to notice characteristics that did not match her extensive knowledge of moose behavior and anatomy. The creature moved with a fluidity that seemed wrong for such a large ungulate, its gait lacking the awkward but purposeful movements that characterized normal moose locomotion. More disturbing was the way it held its head, turning to survey its surroundings with an alertness and intelligence that seemed to transcend typical animal awareness of environmental threats. Through her high-powered spotting scope, Indy could see that the creature's eyes were fixed directly on her concealed position. Despite the distance and her careful camouflage, the moose was not simply scanning for potential predators or competitors, but was studying her specifically, evaluating her presence with what could only be described as conscious assessment rather than instinctive reaction. The animal's gaze held a quality of recognition that made her skin crawl with the realization that she was not observing typical wildlife behavior. As darkness fell and Indy switched to her night vision equipment, the moose began to exhibit behavior that violated every biological principle she had ever studied. Rather than following the normal nocturnal patterns that would lead it to feeding areas or water sources, the creature began to change. Its massive form seemed to ripple and flow like liquid, with body parts shifting and reforming in ways that defied the structural limitations of mammalian skeletal and muscular systems. Before her astonished eyes, the moose transformed into a black bear, its antlers dissolving into nothing, while its body compacted and its limbs shortened to accommodate a completely different anatomical structure. But the transformation did not stop there. The bear form lasted only minutes before flowing into the shape of a wolf, then a deer, then something that resembled a mountain lion. Despite the fact that such predators had been extinct in Minnesota for over a century, each transformation was smooth and seemingly effortless, as if the creature possessed no fixed physical form, but rather existed as some kind of spiritual essence that could assume whatever appearance best suited its immediate purposes. Throughout all of these changes, one characteristic remained constant: the intelligent, evaluating gaze that never left Indy's position. As if the shape-shifting entity was studying her reactions to its display of supernatural abilities, the creature continued its metamorphoses throughout the night, cycling through dozens of different animal forms while maintaining its position on the far shore of Lost Lake. It became birds that were far too large to achieve flight, fish that somehow survived on dry land, and combinations of different species that created impossible hybrid forms that should not have been able to exist according to any known biological principles. Each transformation seemed designed to test Indy's understanding of what was possible in the natural world, pushing her scientific skepticism to its absolute limits. As dawn approached, the shape-shifting entity began to take on forms that were increasingly disturbing in their implications. It assumed the appearance of animals that had been extinct for decades in the region: woodland caribou, wolves, wolverines, and lynx that had been eliminated by hunting and habitat destruction, but which continued to exist in some spiritual dimension that intersected with physical reality at locations like Lost Lake. The creature seemed to be showing her the ghostly remnants of the ecosystem that had once thrived in these northern forests. Species that survived only as memories held by entities that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional biological classification. But the most terrifying transformation occurred just as the sun was rising above the eastern hills. The creature assumed human form, taking on the appearance of a Native American man dressed in traditional clothing that belonged to no specific historical period, but seemed to combine elements from various eras of indigenous culture. The figure stood at the edge of the lake and called to her across the water, speaking in what sounded like Ojibwe, but with words and intonations that seemed to predate any living language. The entity's human form was not quite right, lacking the subtle imperfections and individual characteristics that would mark it as genuinely human, rather than an approximation created by some intelligence that understood human appearance, but not human essence. Its movements were too fluid, its proportions slightly incorrect, and its eyes held the same evaluating intelligence that had characterized all of its previous animal forms. The creature was studying her through yet another disguise, testing whether she would respond differently to a humanoid appearance than she had to its animal transformations. Robert appeared in his canoe shortly after sunrise, paddling quickly across the lake to Indy's Island with an expression of urgent concern that suggested he had been aware of the supernatural encounter despite his distance from her observation post. He spoke rapidly in Ojibwe while helping her pack her equipment, his words conveying meanings that transcended language barriers and communicated the absolute necessity of leaving Lost Lake immediately before the shape-shifting entity decided to approach more closely. As they paddled away from the sacred lake, Indy looked back to see the creature standing at the water's edge in its human form, watching their departure. With what might have been curiosity or disappointment, it raised one hand in what could have been interpreted as either a greeting or a farewell, its gesture carrying implications that Indy did not want to explore. The entity remained visible until their canoe rounded a bend in the outlet stream, at which point it simply vanished as if it had never existed at all. The footage Indy had captured during her night of observation showed only normal wildlife behavior, with no trace of the shape-shifting creature or its impossible transformations. Her audio recordings contained only typical forest sounds, despite her clear memory of the entity's attempts at human speech. Even her detailed written notes about the encounter seemed to fade and become a label within days of her return to civilization, as if some force was actively working to prevent documentation of what she had witnessed. Robert refused to discuss what had occurred at Lost Lake, deflecting her questions with gentle changes of subject and reminders that some experiences were meant to remain private rather than being shared with the wider world. The woodland caribou she had been sent to document were never conclusively proven to exist in the Boundary Waters region, though researchers continue to find tracks and other evidence that suggests the presence of species that should no longer be able to survive in the increasingly fragmented wilderness of northern Minnesota. Lost Lake continues to exist in its remote location, accessible only to those who possess both the navigation skills and the cultural knowledge necessary to find it among the maze of waterways that protect it from casual discovery. The shape-shifting entity that Indai encountered there presumably continues its eternal vigil, taking whatever forms are necessary to observe and evaluate the humans who occasionally venture into its sacred territory, serving as a guardian of mysteries that predate scientific understanding and will likely survive long after contemporary knowledge systems have been forgotten by future generations.